Hi there, welcome to your lesson on data sampling. Okay, this lesson is all about discussing techniques used to gather a sample from a population. The population represents the full population or group that you want to be able to make some conclusions about. Often it is inconvenient to gather data from the whole population. For example, if we wanted data about the entire population of the United States, it would be inconvenient to gather that data from every single person. Therefore, what we do is we take a sample, which is a small group from the population, but we want to make sure that that sample is a good representation of the whole. And that is where population sampling comes in. How can we choose the best sample to represent the whole? So sampling techniques. As I mentioned, it is often difficult to collect data about the entire population that you plan to analyze. Therefore, a sample of the whole population is taken and used to represent the whole. The sample, however, must be non-biased so that it can be a reliable statistical representation of the whole population. So sampling bias. If we do a sample, or if we do bad sampling, we can end up with bias. Sampling bias is when taking a sample from a population, some members of the population are more or less likely to be selected than others. That is where we see sampling bias. For example, again, you're trying to take a sample to represent the whole United States, but somehow your sample ends up having mostly Californians in it. That would be a biased sample. So how do we avoid sample bias? Well, there's different techniques. Let's take a look. So sampling techniques. In order to produce an unbiased sample, there are a number of established sampling methods which statisticians have developed. The best method for any given scenario will depend on what information you may want to find out and the nature of the population from which you're taking the sample. The combination of two or more of these sampling techniques might well result in the best sample. So let's look at these sampling techniques. The first one is called a convenience sample. Notice in this diagram here, here's the researcher right here, and the sample is taken those that are most accessible to the researcher, and that is why it's called a convenience sample. But notice in this convenience sample, none of these purple people were represented because by convenience, none of them were closest to the researcher or most accessible. So please take a moment now, read the definition of convenience sampling, read the example, and then provide your own example of a convenience sample. All right, I hope that makes sense when you read it and you came up with your own good example. Let's look at the next sampling technique. Next one is called a simple random sample. And as you can see here, we have random people from this population have been selected. So as before, please take a moment now to read the definition, read the example, and create your own example. Okay, once again, I hope you understand this type of sampling and you came up with a solid example of your own. Let's go on to the next technique. This is called systematic sampling. In this case, we begin at any fixed a fixed position in the data set. Here we began at person number 2 in the population, and then from there we selected people that were at intervals of 3. So from 2 we went to person 5, and from 5 we went to person 8, and from 8 to 11, and so on. So we begin at some number and then use a fixed interval between to select our sample from the whole population. So please read this definition once again and this example and come up with your own example. All right, once again, hope everything makes sense and you have come up with a good example. Let's go on to our last two sampling techniques. One of them is called a stratified sampling technique. In this case, we take our whole population, we divide it into subgroups, which are called strata, and then randomly select people from the subgroups to get our sample group, which includes members from all the strata. Okay, please read the definition here, look at the example, and then create your own example of stratified sampling. Okay, I think we're ready for our last sampling technique. This is called quota sampling. Quota sampling is very much like stratified sampling, except for that when we break the population down into subgroups, we then say we want our sample to represent the same proportion as each subgroup is of the main population. So here we can see a population that has 50% male, 50% female, and then 70% white and 30% black. In that case, we want our quota to represent the same proportions. So please read this, look at the example, and give your own example of quota sampling. Okay, I hope that process has allowed you to become familiar with the 5 main sampling techniques. So now we're going to look at, there is a list here of people that are running some sampling in maybe in their own classes or their own schools to conduct some kind of survey. And basically your job is to take these 5 examples and say what kind of sampling each one is. As a reminder, on the bottom we will have the 5 sampling techniques there in diagram form. So please go ahead and select the proper sampling technique to that class that describes each of these 5 situations. All right, let's check. First one, convenience sampling. Next one, stratified. Next one is stratified again. This one here is random sampling or simple random sampling, and this last one here is systematic sampling. Notice we have not seen quota sampling here at all. Or yeah, that's it. Okay, great. One last question. Let's say you have decided to do your Math IA, your exploration project about the heights of students at ISL or at your school. To do a proper analysis, you need to gather student height data. Gathering the height of every student is too difficult. Therefore, imagine trying to get the height of every student in the school. That's a lot. Therefore, you consider sampling approaches we've discussed, which would produce a non-biased sample that could be used to represent the population. So here are 5 different options. I want you to tell me each option, what kind of sampling it represents, and then finally choose which of these 5 techniques that are described here you think would be the best one to use for this little experiment. Okay, great. Through that process, I hope you've learned a little bit about statistical sampling and you have a better idea of when to use each kind of sampling and perhaps which are the best. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.